The morning a seed contractor told 3 small farms their jobs were too small to justify the trip, June Talley dragged a wooden machine out from under her shed roof. It had no motor, no battery, no fuel tank. Just 2 screens, a fan box, a set of worn gears, and a hand crank polished smooth by people who had been dead for decades. By noon, 3 pickups were backed into June's yard waiting for it. 6 months earlier, most of those same people had called the machine an antique. June had called it a backup. She was 60 years old and farmed a modest patch of ground in the Central Plains, enough pasture for a small cattle herd, several acres of grain and forage, and a market garden that always seemed to produce more work than produce. She was not against modern equipment. That was the part people kept getting wrong. For 23 years, June had worked the parts counter at an independent implement dealership. She knew what a hydraulic pump could save a farmer in labor. She knew what a combine could do in a day that a crew with hand tools could not finish in a week. She also knew how many enormous machines could be stopped by one sensor, one electronic module, one back-ordered bearing, or one payment a farmer could not make in a bad year. The lesson June carried home from the parts counter was not that modern machinery was foolish. It was that dependence had a shape. You could see it every time a farmer walked into the dealership with a machine worth more than his house and a failed part small enough to fit in his palm. When the dealership finally closed, June kept almost nothing from the place. One thing she did keep was a stack of old service notebooks the owner had been ready to throw away. They covered equipment nobody serviced anymore. Hand shellers, belt-driven mills, fanning machines, simple pumps, cultivators built before sealed electronics and proprietary software became part of farming. June put the notebooks on a shelf and went back to her own work. Then, one winter, a demolition crew began tearing down an abandoned grain shed outside town. Against one wall sat an old fanning mill, a wooden seed-cleaning machine, with a hand crank and a fan that pushed light chaff away while grain passed across interchangeable screens. The crew planned to break it apart so it would fit in a scrap trailer. June paid them enough to leave it whole. It took 2 people and a furniture dolly to get the thing into her shed. Her neighbor, Nolan Price, came over while she was cleaning mouse nests out of the fan box. "What are you going to do with that?" "Find out if it still works," June said. Nolan looked at the crank, then at the electric seed cleaner sitting in his own shop across the road. "And if it does?" June shrugged. "Then I will have a seed cleaner that starts every time my arm does." Nolan laughed, but not cruelly. Most people did. The first test gave them something to laugh about. June poured a bucket of old wheat into the hopper, turned the crank, and watched half the grain bounce across the wrong screen, while dust blew straight back into her face. A leather drive strip snapped before she had finished the bucket. The machine was not magic. It was not even adjusted correctly. That failure was the reason June kept going. She found a retired shop foreman named Wes Carver who still remembered how fanning mills were set for different seed sizes. He did not restore the machine for her. He made her measure the openings, study the airflow, cut a new drive strip, and learn what changed when she fed grain too fast. "Old equipment will forgive a lot," Wes told her, "but it will not forgive somebody who refuses to learn it." By early spring, June could run a sack of grain through the mill without throwing half of it onto the floor. More important, she began thinking in functions instead of machines. What did a small farm absolutely need to keep doing if the convenient option became too expensive, unavailable, or delayed? Seed had to be cleaned. Corn had to be shelled. Tools had to be sharpened and repaired. Water had to move. Feed sometimes had to be cracked or ground in small quantities. June was not trying to recreate a farm from 100 years earlier. She was trying to build a second path for the jobs that could stop a small operation cold. Over the next year, the shed filled with simple equipment chosen for that reason. A cast-iron hand sheller, a treadle grinding wheel, a small hand-operated burr mill, a heavy bench vise, a manual transfer pump, a compact forge that could heat a bent bracket when waiting 3 days for a new one made no sense. She mounted the most useful pieces on an old flatbed utility trailer so they could travel, instead of becoming another collection nobody touched. That was when the jokes changed. People started calling it June's no-fuel trailer. Nolan called it her apocalypse wagon. June ignored both names. She wrote one word on a piece of plywood and screwed it to the inside of the shed wall. Back up. That summer turned dry. Not dramatic all at once. Just week after week with less rain than the ground needed. Pastures browned early. Hay tightened. Feed costs climbed. Every unnecessary trip began to matter. Every repair bill felt heavier. The larger farms still had options. They could buy service contracts, schedule contractors, carry spare components, and spread a bad expense across more acres. Smaller operators had less room. A couple named Evan and Cara Weller felt that first. They had been saving a portion of their own rye and wheat seed to reduce what they would need to buy for fall planting. Normally, a mobile seed cleaning contractor came through the area near the end of summer. That year, the contractor combined routes, raised the minimum job size, and told the Wellers their few dozen sacks were not enough to justify a stop. Buying certified replacement seed was possible. It was also money they had been counting on for hay. Cara called June because she had heard about the wooden fanning mill. June did not promise it would solve the problem. She told them to bring 3 sacks first. They set the mill in the open doorway where the dust could blow out, changed screens, adjusted the fan, and started cranking. The first sack took too long. Evan fed grain too quickly and the screen loaded up. June slowed him down. Cara began swapping full containers before they overflowed. By the 3rd sack, they had a rhythm. Dirty grain went in. Light chaff lifted away. Broken kernels and weed seed dropped where they could be separated. Clean planting grain collected at the end. It was not fast. That mattered. 3 people working by hand could not match a commercial cleaner built to process grain by the truckload. Their shoulders hurt. Dust got into everything. The old mill demanded attention every minute it ran. But the Wellers did not have a truckload. They had a small seed lot, a shrinking budget, and a contractor who had already told them no. For that problem, on that scale, the slow machine was enough. The Wellers finished their seed over 2 evenings. Then another neighbor called. Then Nolan did. His problem was different. A cracked bracket on an older hay rake had failed during the worst part of the dry spell. The replacement could be ordered, but delivery would take several days. June's little forge and vise did not create a factory new part. They did let Nolan heat, straighten, reinforce, and refit the bracket well enough to keep the rake working until the correct replacement arrived. That was the moment Nolan stopped calling the trailer an apocalypse wagon. He began calling it when he needed something. The biggest change came from a farmer named Russ Danner, who had been the most open about thinking June's project was pointless. Russ ran far more ground than June did. He owned modern machinery because his acreage required it. Nothing on June's trailer could replace his planter, sprayer, or combine. He knew that, and so did she. What he had not considered was how many smaller jobs on his farm did not require those machines at all. Late that summer, Russ found himself with a small batch of cover crop seed, contaminated with enough chaff and weed seed that he did not want to put it through a drill. The quantity was too small to rearrange a contractor's schedule, and replacing it would mean spending money he was already trying not to spend. He brought 1 sack to June. Neither of them mentioned the jokes. June showed him how to select the screen and how to listen to the fan. Too much air and he would lose good seed with the trash. Too little and the chaff would ride through. Russ turned the crank until his forearm tightened. "This is slow," he said. "Yes," June answered. "Very slow. Still yes." He looked at the clean seed dropping into the tub. Then he kept turning. What spread through the county after that was not a movement to abandon tractors. It was a habit of asking a different question. What happens if the primary system is unavailable? June began keeping a list, not of antique machines, but of capabilities. Who still had a hand pump? Who owned a forge? Who had a working sheller? Who knew how to sharpen a sickle section instead of replacing the entire assembly? Who had harness gear and draft experience? Who could repair a wooden gate, rebuild a simple carburetor, clean seed, patch leather, weld or braze? Some of those skills were old, some were not. The point was not age. The point was having more than one way to keep working. That winter, a dozen farms began a loose equipment and skills circle. Nothing formal, no museum, no grant, no polished sign over a barn door. They made copies of June's capability list and added phone numbers. A young farmer offered a portable welder. An older couple added a cider press and a grain scale. Nolan contributed a manual post driver. Russ surprised everyone by bringing over a belt-driven feed grinder that had been sitting behind his machine shed for years. June helped him free the seized shaft. The circle had limits, and June made sure nobody forgot them. Hand power could save a small seed lot. It could not harvest 1,000 acres before a storm. A forge could make an emergency repair. It could not turn unsafe metal into a permanent factory-grade part. A manual pump could move water. It could not replace a high-capacity irrigation system. Backup did not mean better. It meant available when the first choice was not. The next spring, modern machinery still rolled across Prairie Bend County. Tractors planted the big fields. Diesel trucks hauled fertilizer. Computers mapped passes more accurately than June's father would have believed possible. June had never wanted any of that to disappear. On Russ Danner's place, one of those modern drills crossed a field carrying seed from the lot he had cleaned by hand in June's shed. A week later, thin green rows began showing through the soil. Russ drove past them twice before he finally stopped. He crouched beside the first row, rubbed the dry dirt between his fingers, and looked back toward the road. Nothing about the field looked old-fashioned. That was the part he had finally understood. The old machine had never been the future. It had simply kept one door open when the new system had closed another. Back at June's place, under the open shed roof, the wooden fanning mill was turning again for the next sack.